Hello, everyone. Welcome to the live and pre-recorded session. We're starting Unit 6 today, and Unit 6 is all about the origin of Earth and evolution and adaptation, right? So how we evolved and how we have come to adapt to our surroundings to be best fitted to survive. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and we are going to begin and talk about the origins of Earth, the beginning of Earth. How did this wonderful life begin? So I'm going to share my computer sound with you.
Life appeared on Earth almost 4 billion years ago. Origin of life can be understood in the background of origin of Earth and universe. With Big Bang, the universe expanded and temperature came down. The gravity condensed gases and formed galaxies. Earth evolved around 4.5 billion years ago in Milky Way galaxy. On early Earth, there was a hostile environment. Water vapor, CH4, NH3, CO2 releasing from Earth's surface. There are several theories on origin of life. Panspermia. According to ancient Greeks, units of life called spores transferred to Earth. Spontaneous generation believes life arose from rotting and decayed material. But spontaneous generation was turned down by Louis Pasteur's experiments. In pre-sterilized flasks, life didn't evolve from dead yeast, but in other flasks open to air, which contains life forms like bacteria, living organism arose from dead yeast, implying life comes only from pre-existing life. However, how the first life came on Earth. Apparin and Haldane proposed that first from life could have come from pre-existing non-living organic molecules, RNA, protein, after the chemical evolution in which organic molecules formed from inorganic constituents. To test this hypothesis, Miller, at laboratory scale, created similar condition of early Earth. He set up electric discharge in a closed flask containing CH4, NH3, H2, and water vapor at 800 degrees Celsius and observed formation of amino acid, building blocks of protein. With this evidence, chemical evolution theory is partly accepted.
All right, so the early origins of Earth, meaning where did we begin? How did this life begin? And so, as you see, there are many theories about how we started on life or how life started. However, let's go through and talk about how old Earth is, and maybe we can try to understand how we got to where we are today. So Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago. So Earth is estimated to be about 4.5 billion years old. And so just to give you an idea, 4.5 billion, a 1 billion is made up of 1,000 millions. And 1 million is made up of 1,000 thousands, right? So 4.5 billion years ago is a long time ago. And so it started out as this molten rock, right? With just lava, and it was constantly being hit by asteroids and comets that were just flying about in the universe. And so these huge collisions or impacts of rocks, of asteroids, which are space rocks, happened and would just hit the Earth, boom, boom, back and forth, just hit the Earth, okay? And eventually the Earth began to cool down. So it wasn't so hot and hostile. It began to cool down. And so in the process of Earth cooling down, the oceans formed from water vapor that came from the volcanoes. So that water vapor that came up along with the cooling action created oceans. So there must have been many, 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 many volcanoes to create so much water vapor to the point where oceans were created. Okay, so here's our Milky Way, filled with planets and asteroids. This is a wonderful asteroid belt we're looking at. And these asteroids and space rocks would just slam into the Earth. And so then the Earth, as you can see, this hot molten lava ball existed. So this hot molten lava ball, right? Early Earth, early conditions. How was the Earth in this hot environment, this hostile, evil, mean environment where nothing could survive, right? On this early Earth, there were lots and lots of chemicals like hydrogen and helium and water vapor from the volcanoes and carbon dioxide and nitrogen, right? So these were all inorganic and organic molecules that were just existing on Earth. It was too hostile for life. And there was no oxygen at first for over 1 billion years. So there could be no life because there was no oxygen. And all life needs oxygen, or majority of life needs oxygen. Not all life, majority. But there was no oxygen at this time. And so here we have early Earth, just this ball of water vapor and lava. And the atmosphere, again, had no oxygen. Oxygen finally came about when the very first prokaryotes, bacteria, the very first prokaryotes would do photosynthesis. They were often called cyanobacteria. So let me see if I can get my annotation out. These were often called cyanobacteria. These first prokaryotes that could do photosynthesis were called cyanobacteria. And once they started doing photosynthesis, once they started making all of this oxygen, there was too much oxygen. And so what we can see is that prokaryotes were the first living things on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. So the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And for about 1 billion years, nothing existed. It was just inorganic molecules, hot lava, ocean. But then 1 billion years later, our first kinds of prokaryotes, called cyanobacteria, were able to make oxygen. They were our photosynthetic prokaryotes that were able to make oxygen, which then over time gave rise to eukaryotes, small unicellular eukaryotes, which then over time evolved into multicellular eukaryotes. So before photosynthetic prokaryotes, there were most likely anaerobic prokaryotes who didn't need oxygen. So bacteria who didn't need oxygen in order to make energy for themselves and live and survive. Okay, so what I want to stress is that prokaryotes were the very first organisms on this earth. And prokaryotes they're similar to bacteria that we know today. They were able to live in those hot, extreme environments with that nitrogen and that CO2 and that water vapor. They were able to thrive in those hot environments, in those hostile environments. And so about 500 million years later, so about 500 million years later, photosynthetic prokaryotes like cyanobacteria evolved. And this bacteria was able to make oxygen through photosynthesis. This allowed oxygen to enter into the atmosphere. So here was the hostile environment. And after those photosynthetic eukaryotes prokaryotes came about, now they gave rise to the allowance of more life forms. So oxygen has now been released into the atmosphere through cyanobacteria. This cyanobacteria was able to release oxygen through photosynthesis. Okay. So then unicellular eukaryotic organisms evolved after the photosynthetic prokaryotes. Okay? And so this is called the endosymbiotic theory, how they came about, meaning that chloroplasts and mitochondria evolved from a symbiotic bacteria that lived inside a larger prokaryote. So it is theorized that chloroplasts and mitochondria were independent bacteria. So chloroplasts and mitochondria were independent organisms. And a larger bacteria engulfed or ate those smaller bacteria. And now one bacteria is able to live inside the other. And since both of them benefit from the arrangement, the internal bacteria is now passed on from generation to generation. So basically, chloroplasts and mitochondria, if you remember, have their own DNA. Mitochondria has their own DNA and chloroplasts have their own DNA too, which further supports that they used to be a part of or used to be separate bacteria. And when they got engulfed by a larger bacteria who was able to use their machinery, but they also benefited from being inside that big bacteria, they were able to work together and continue to coexist. So about 2 billion years ago, after this endosymbiotic theory, unicellular eukaryotes became more common. And remember, you do have a nucleus. So eukaryotes were cells with a nucleus, whereas prokaryotes had no nucleus. So those first cells, those simple cells, they had no nucleus. But as time went on, the cells evolved into new cells that contained nuclei. And they also contained a wide range of organelles that could help them carry out function. Unicellular eukaryotes were one cell able to carry out all the life processes they need. Uni means one, so they were one cellular, single celled, excuse me. Some of our eukaryotes were photosynthetic and some were not. Remember, amoeba and parameciums were not photosynthetic. So amoebas and parameciums were not photosynthetic, but euglenas were. But all of these were unicellular eukaryotes. If you need a refresher on unicellular eukaryotes, please go back to Unit 2. So our amoebas and our paramecium were non-photosynthetic eukaryotes, unicellular eukaryotes, but euglena contained those chloroplasts and were able to do photosynthesis, thus making them photosynthetic. And lastly, multicellular eukaryotes evolved from those single-celled eukaryotes about 580 million years ago. Multicellular eukaryotes are organisms that are made of more than one cell. These organisms eventually move from the sea to the land. And so among the first of these organisms were plants. Land plants were the first organisms on land. They were about 500, so land plants, or plants in general, are about 500 million years old. Shortly after, about 50 million years later, your fish start to appear. So the first fish evolve in the oceans. About 50 million years after that, so about 400 million years ago, amphibians like frogs evolved from fish onto land. Notice how frogs, or amphibians in general, have two lives. They begin in the sea and they end on land. About 300 million years ago, reptiles evolved from amphibians. So these reptiles are the ones that stay on the land. Dinosaurs were kinds of reptiles. So you had the Bronchiosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus and the Laurosaurus. All these different kinds of reptiles were all dinosaurs, or dinosaurs were reptiles. About 200 million years after that, mammals evolved. So your mammals evolved after the reptiles became extinct. And so currently now we're in the age of mammals. The first humanoids, or the first early humans, evolved about 50 million years ago. A humanoid just means a human-like organism. All right, so that is our lecture on early Earth and a quick overview of how we evolved from anaerobic prokaryotes in a hostile, hot, a hot, lava-infused planet, to the Cenozoic era, the age of the mammals.